I still haven't got around to talking about James by Percival Everett, so let's do that. At the time of recording this, we don't yet know the outcome of the Booker Prize for Fiction this year. If this doesn't win, I would be very surprised because while I've not read the other shortlist novels, this for me has all of the necessary ingredients. Like, it's clever, it's well written, it's doing something which necessarily we haven't seen before in a Booker Prize winner, but it would still fit in with the family of previous winners. Like, I definitely see this as the 2024 winner. And I'm even saying that as someone who has not read Huckleberry Finn, or any Mark Twain for that matter. Because as much as I love this, there was definitely a sense of putting the cart before the horse, where I think Percival Everett makes a lot of very clever parallels to the story that this is essentially a retelling of, but because I've not engaged with the original source material, I think a lot of that genius sort of went right over my head, which is obviously not a fault of the book, but I think I would have loved this even more if I'd had the foresight to read Huck Finn first. You know, it's very similar to like reading Wide Sargasso Sea without having read Jane Eyre. You know, it takes away some of the context. I was really taken aback as well by how casual and readable the tone of this story is. Like, this seems like the sort of book that you could eat up in one sitting. I read it in 3, which is still not a very large amount of time. But it's just, the language is very approachable. Like, I think this is a great gateway novel into the topics that it deals with. Things like the 19th century history surrounding slavery, the Civil War, the antebellum South. I think all of that is handled very well in this, and in a way that has like a very wide appeal without being too traumatic. Like, there are definitely trigger warnings, but it takes you like with a very gentle hand, is what I would say. By far the most thought-provoking parts of this, for me at least, was the contrast between how the black people sort of put on this affect of speaking because it was the expectation that their white owners had of how they were supposed to sound, because they'd not had like this education, so they must be, you know, stupid. And then actually seeing how they talk to one another and realising that wasn't the case at all. In a lot of ways they are more wise than their white counterparts. And that whole conversation was done so brilliantly. I mean, you can see why. I think the second chapter in this book, the Booker Prize did like a dramatic reading of it on their page, which is amazing. If you haven't go checked it out, please do, because our main character, Jim slash James later on in the story, he is doing like a language lesson for all of the younger slaves, teaching them how you have to talk a certain way because the white people will, like, they like to feel superior, and so you have to act in a way that makes them, like, it confirms their wrong belief that you are inferior, if that makes sense. And it was so cleverly done. That was something as well that really stuck out to me, not just how brilliantly this book captures the suffering that millions and millions of black people went through at the hands of the slave trade, but the way that it represents white fragility, the way that every white character has some form of like insecurity or at least unconscious bias that they're like consistently projecting because they know what they're doing is wrong, and they know they're so they're trying to hide it, but they're intimidated because they know that this is all coming to a head. And all of the conversations in the third act where Jim like shows that he is actually very knowledgeable and can speak better than these white folks, you see the terror in their eyes where they don't expect it, and it was really well done. One thing that I didn't care for in this book, it was the third act twist, and I'm going to explain what the twist is, so if you have any desire to read this book and go into it without knowing what the twist is going to be, then turn away now, come back to this video later when you've read the book, because this is the point of no return, you know? Full disclaimer, spoiler alert. So, Jim, who at this point is going by James, tells Huck, who they've been like on their travels together trying to escape. From what I can get from the original story, like Huck fakes his own death to get away from his abusive father, and Jim is a runaway slave, and they sort of travel together. But then Jim tells Huck, I was really close with your mother growing up, and actually I'm your father, which was so out of the blue, so ridiculously unexpected, and I couldn't parse the significance of it. In fact, I actually thought it cheapened a lot of the sentiments that felt very earnest up until that point. Because, to my understanding, the story was teaching us about, like, found family and how, like, skin colour shouldn't have this much of a bearing on, like, equality, and the fact that Huck and Jim have had these shared experiences together. They have this camaraderie that transcends family and biology and all of that. So for Jim to then turn right around and be like, oh, I'm your dad, it was a bit like, huh? Like, if I reread this book, I don't think there would be anything in the first 2/3 of the story that would make me think that, which annoys me. Like, I don't want an out of the blue twist just for the sake of shocking the audience. I should be able to go back and see all of the little pieces that were leading up to this big reveal, and I don't think they're there because it was so like, oh, like, it didn't make any sense to me, because there were so many moments where Jim could have been more protective if Huck was actually his son. Like, I understand that he was tentative because obviously black people in America were treated as sort of like property, and they weren't allowed to speak out as much. But still, even so, there were moments where it just felt like, oh, if he's really your son, the bond should be much closer. Like, there's a huge part of the story where they're not even together anymore because Jim gets bought to be part of this minstrel show. Meanwhile, Huck gets taken away by these, like, fraudsters, and they don't cross paths again until they're on, like, a boat together that, like, explodes. So much of this story, I just didn't see it. I was like, oh, he's your father? Okay. I'm probably giving this information more attention than it deserves, but it's only because it really threw me for a loop, and I do still really love this book. But was it lifted from the original story? Like, does Huck Finn, does he find out that he's related to the runaway slave? I don't think that happens. And it was so just like, huh? Like, what purpose does that serve? I couldn't tell you, because the ending doesn't really do anything with that. Like, essentially, the ending as well is very fairy tale. Like, I could have done with a bit more. There could have been more consequences. I mean, that's just the type of reader I am. I'm always here for a very, like, devastating ending where the repercussions are felt and there's sort of that lingering feeling of, oh my goodness, what did I just read? This was much more pleasant, you know, like Jim goes back and finds his wife and daughter and saves them from their new owner, and they have this big uprising. But yeah, it's a much more pleasant ending than probably the historic reality. But that's neither here nor there. I do think James is a fabulous book. As I said, if it doesn't win the Booker Prize, I will be shocked. But then last year I got it wrong as well. I thought The Bee Sting was going to win, so I guess we'll see. But yeah, what a fabulous read for Black History Month. I mean, it's November now, but I did read it back in October, and it did teach me stuff. Like, I learnt about Denmark VC, like one of the original sort of like rebellion leaders. There's some cool stuff in here.